Hello everyone, this will be the second week of the philosophy of mind. This lecture will be looking at a couple of physicalist theories of what constitutes the mind. Last time we looked at Descartes and substance dualism. Substance dualism is a philosophy that mind is separate substance than that of the body. The body, which includes the brain, is comprised of physical stuff that can be scientifically explored. It is visible and tangible. It has physical properties like weight, mass, color, etc. The mind, on the other hand, is comprised of very different stuff that is non-material. Qualities of the mind include its ability to picture images, reflect, think, believe, etc. While we usually attribute these things to the brain, it's unclear that the brain and the mind are the same. One question that we are forced to ask is, how does this physical organ give rise to the pictures in my head when I imagine a sunset? My beliefs and memories are often very vivid, and it's unclear how my meaty brain creates something that doesn't occupy physical space. My beliefs are not something that seem to be extended in space like my hands or my liver. These things can be explored by a doctor. They have a weight, a shape, size. My sense of pain is not extended. When I'm in pain, something physical in my body hurts, but that sense of feeling is not something that has weight or color. Descartes believed that the mind and the body were two very different substances. We explored 4 arguments last lecture that supported his belief. The first argument was that substance dualism just seems intuitively correct. Humans often feel special, and that there is something more to us than just our body. Religions often point to a spiritual realm that we are not necessarily a part of. For Descartes, a religious understanding of the soul is equivalent to the mind. The mind and the soul are therefore the essence of a person. It is immaterial, but nevertheless works hand in hand with the body. We also speak as if our mind is separate from the brain, and picture the mind, like Descartes, as being different than the physical body. The next argument we looked at was the conceivability argument. The conceivability argument suggests that since we can conceive of the mind as existing apart from the body, the mind must exist as something different than the body. Because if we can imagine it as being apart, it cannot be the case that it is the same thing. The mind is its own thing, namely an immaterial substance. We can also think about the body existing apart from the mind. Philosophical zombies come to mind. A philosophical zombie is a person who exists just as any normal person exists, but with no consciousness. The person is able to respond, act, and do everything that a normal person does and says, but there is nothing going on inside its brain, where we may consider the mind to reside. The philosophical zombie has no mind. The problem with this argument, however, becomes whether we can actually conceive of this possibility of the mind existing without the body. The third argument we looked at was the indivisibility argument. The indivisibility argument suggested that the body is made up of physical stuff that is extended in space and had qualities that could be scientifically explored. Because the body was extended in space, it is the case that I can divide the physical thing that exists. I can have a brain or split an atom. However, minds are not extended in space. They are not something that I can evaluate physically. I therefore cannot split a mind like I would a brain. And since I cannot physically split a mind, it must be of a different substance than that of the brain or body. Again, this seems intuitive to us, but who's to say that we cannot split a mind? The problem with this argument is that it may be the case that the mind could be split. We often see experiments and studies where a person is given a lobotomy and afterwards his or her mind is no longer what it was. He or she loses mental functions and capacities that were associated with the brain. It may therefore be the case that minds can be split by splitting the brain, since minds and brains are the same. Another problem also exists in that perhaps not all physical things that are extended in space can be divisible. Scientifically, we have explored a number of quantum mechanic particles, and while we often claim that we have come to the smallest piece of matter, and then find out that we can split it, and that it is comprised of other smaller pieces of matter, perhaps there is an end to this process. After the atom, we discovered that there was a nucleus inside that atom. And then we discovered that inside that nucleus were protons and neutrons. And then inside the protons were quarks. And then the Higgs boson particle. But what if the Higgs boson is actually the smallest piece of matter and is in fact indivisible? It would then suggest that not all physical things are indivisible, and the argument of indivisibility would rest on a false premise. The last argument from the previous lecture was the argument against physicalism. This argument simply attacks the idea that the world is made up of physical stuff by claiming that the physical world is not equipped to offer evidence or explanation of all that exists. There is also non-material stuff out there, and the physical world is unable to shed light on these things. For instance, the physical world in my body, chemistry, and biology cannot tell me what it is like to see a sunset or taste something sweet. Science can tell me what is going on in my brain and body when I see a sunset or taste something sweet, but it can't tell me what that experience is like. This is perhaps one of the stronger arguments against substance this is perhaps one of the stronger arguments for substance dualism. We still tackle the idea of physicalism, and in today's lecture we will explore not only the theories for physicalism, but why these theories are problematic. And by the end, you just maybe will think that substance dualism has something going for it. The first physicalist theory that we're going to look at is identity theory. Identity theory states that the mind is the brain. They are identical. Mental states are brain states. So when brain activity occurs, mental activity occurs too, because they are the same. This theory was popularized in the mid to late 20th century and the rise of science and technology. The more we learned about the brain, the more it seemed to correlate to our minds. When we think of correlation between brain states and mental states, we see that changes in brain states often lead to changes in mental states and vice versa. For instance, if I consume alcohol, my brain begins to operate slightly differently than before my consumption. It is also the case that when my brain starts to operate differently, my mind similarly operates differently. I become drunk, my sense of balance is shot, my ability to store memories is hindered, my inhibitions are nowhere to be found, etc. Similarly, my mental states have correlation to my brain states, and thus affect my body, as is the case when I'm stressed before taking an important test. That stress is seen in the body by evidence of certain brain activity that causes perspiration, nausea, etc. Now, identity theorists and physicalists concede the idea that we don't know everything about the brain, and so there are things about the mind that are still elusive to us. But as science and technology advances, so will our understanding of the mind. Now, it's important with identity theorists that when we talk about the mind and the brain, or body, we are not saying that the mind and the body are connected. Instead, we are saying that the mind is the body and the body is the mind. They are the same thing, we just talk about them differently. Explaining the mind in physical terms is just like the scientific way in which we explain something that we may not yet understand completely, or the layman's way of explaining a scientific phenomenon. So when we speak of something like pain, for instance, what pain is C fibers firing in the brain. Now, as a brief disclaimer, C fibers are not actually something scientific and are not real things in the brain. They are just explanatory tools to draw out the correlation between minds and brains. Think of C fibers as the physical process or chemical that fires in the brain when there is a feeling of pain. It is not that the C fiber causes the pain, but that the C fiber is the pain. That is the explanation of pain, C fibers firing in the brain. That feeling is the presence and process of those C fibers being active. The identity theorist then has two obstacles to overcome. First, the identity theorist must explain the nature of identity. So, how do we take the mind and the body to be identical? And second, explain how it can be the case that mental states and physical brain states can be identical in this way. When we speak philosophically about something like identity, it's the case that we must truly understand the meaning of the concept. Some identities are analytic. This means that the identity and underlying nature of a thing can be explained in different ways, but has the same identity. Take, for instance, a square. When we think of a square, a specific shape comes to mind. The criteria for this particular shape is that it has four sides with 90-degree internal angles. When I speak of a square and when I speak of a shape with four sides with 90-degree internal angles, I'm talking about the same thing. Similarly, when I use the term bachelor, the meaning of the term bachelor is an unmarried man. A bachelor is an unmarried man, and an unmarried man is a bachelor. They are the same thing but can be explained differently. The identity of one is the identity of the other. They are the same. They're identical. Some identities, though, are contingent, meaning that they're the same thing even though there are differences that exist among them. Their foundation is the same, but they can be identified separately. An example of a contingent identity is Clark Kent and Superman. Here we can imagine Clark Kent and Superman being the same person. It is the case that Superman just is Clark Kent and Clark Kent is Superman. We do not use these terms analytically, however, because Clark Kent and Superman have differences. There can be no differences between a bachelor and an unmarried man. Clark Kent, however, wears glasses and Superman does not. Clark Kent is meek and soft-spoken, while Superman is powerful and is as alpha as a person could be. We see slight differences between the two, and even though it is just two personas portrayed by the same person, we can speak of the two people differently, and therefore the identity of Clark Kent and Superman are contingent. When we speak of brain states and mental states, it would seem as if we would want to suggest that their identities are analytic. Otherwise, we would need to explain the differences between the brain states and mental states. And if there were differences between the two, we would need to know how they were connected and why there are differences. We therefore need to secure an explanation of the kind of things that mental states are. For instance, we understand lightning as an electrical discharge and water as H2O. The identity of these things are analytic, and the identity of brain states needs an equally identical brain state. Such is the case with the make-believe pain and C fibers. We therefore need to make a type identity claim. We need to explain the type of thing that mental states are, just like H2O is the type of thing that water is. Water being the mental state and H2O being the brain state. It's important now to recognize one of two identity theories that we will discuss further. Type identity theory is the theory that mental states and brain states are of the same type, and the job of science is to discover these identities. So the types of mental states would include a thing like pain, and science would have to tell us what pain is. Perhaps it is our hypothetical C fiber firing. The problem with this, however, is that pain can only be present if and only if C fibers are firing. This is commonly referred to as the problem of multiple realizability. If we suggest that pain is C fibers firing, then nothing can experience pain if its C fibers do not fire. And if it has no C fibers, then it cannot feel or experience pain. Take, for example, an animal such as a chicken. A human's anatomy is much different than that of a chicken. It could therefore be the case that chickens do not have C fibers, and if chickens don't have C fibers, then they can't feel pain. This is very impactful for something like ethics and the treatment of animals. Why would we need to treat animals with respect if they couldn't feel pain, or love, or companionship, or happiness, etc.? We often rip plants and weeds out of the ground, killing them because their genetic makeup is so different that we don't think twice about what the weed is feeling. So what if certain animals were no different than plants? What if a human was born with no C fibers firing, or no brain state explanation of love or contentment? Only being able to realize pain and other mental states is one way, or is a major problem to the type identity theorist position. What is more likely the case is that the same thought or mental state could be realized by different states of my brain at different times. There is a plasticity to the brain that adapts and changes based on the things around it. If part of the brain is damaged, for instance, other parts of the brain will kick in to rewire the brain in order to not lose functionality. When we learn things, we create new synapses that link nerve cells. When some synapses die, others can be utilized to create new pathways for newer cells to travel down. This suggests that the mind can be multiply realized by different brain states. Just because something or someone doesn't have C fibers doesn't necessarily mean that it or he or she can't feel pain. The problem of multipliability is a major obstacle for type identity theorists to overcome. This is a very strong claim made by the identity theorists, and it's one that is impossible to identify, where it's impossible to identify mental properties with physical properties, because everybody is different, and there's always going to be exceptions to people or things or animals that don't have these types of brain states that we're going to want to give mental properties to. We're going to want to say that we can have the same mental property even when different physical properties occur, so that we can associate things like pain or contentment to animals or other people who may not function scientifically in the brain the same as everybody else. The thought then becomes, can we lessen the degree to which we use type identity theory? The philosophy that comes to mind is token identity theory. Now, this is similar to type identity, but token refers to the token thought as being identical with particular brain states. So no general claim can be made about the kind of physical state, only that there is a physical state in which thought is identical. And so when I say something like, I like fish fingers, this physical state, this brain state is going on in my head, and it could be the case that it is C fibers firing. But for my neighbor, when they say they like fish fingers, it could be for them D fibers firing. And for someone else, it could be E fibers firing. And so each mental state is paired with a brain state, but those brain states are subjective to each and every person's specific type of brain state. Now, this view is much weaker than type identity theory, and it really doesn't help us explain what kind of thing pain is. If pain is subjective to absolutely everybody, then what is it that connects our sense of pain? If my pain is C fibers firing and your pain is D fibers firing and someone else's pain is E fibers firing, then what is pain? The identity of this concept pain is different to the point where we can't ever put our finger on what exactly pain is. It doesn't tell us about the mental properties of a thing, only that a mental property has as an identical partner the physical property. Now, there's a certain strength to this idea of the philosophy of mind, and there are weaknesses. The strengths are that there is an abundance of evidence that really supports the correlation between brain states and mental states. I mentioned this earlier, but brain states often occur with mental states and vice versa. Not that one happens and then the other happens, but that when something happens with my brain, some corresponding phenomenon will occur with my mind. So if I were to get brain damage, for instance, if we look to the example given in the video from last week, we saw a story about a man named Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker in the 1800s. And prior to an accident that he had working on the railroad, he was a very pleasant and upbeat person. One day, an accident occurred, and a railroad spike went right through his head, piercing his brain. And while he survived the accident, Phineas Gage was no longer the person that he was. He became short-tempered and more aggressive, and so you can see that his personality, his mental states, changed with the physical states of having the spike go through his brain, losing brain activity, and so forth. And so we see instances where these two things, brain states and mental states, are correlated very closely. The question then becomes, though, are they just correlated, or are they caused, or are they the same? How are we going to deal with or understand mental states being identical to brain states? The weaknesses with this theory of the mind is really the same that we went through last week, in that how is it possible for this physical system to support or underpin, cause, realize, instantiate, or undergo experiences with a phenomenal character? So when we look at the mind and when we look at the brain, it seems as though the mind and brain have very different qualities, one being physical, one being non-physical. And even if identity theorists are going to claim that the mind and the brain are the same, we still have trouble understanding how this physical system gives rise to all this experience that has qualities of a phenomenal nature. The other big problem that identity theorists come across is the problem of multiple realizability. Most of us are going to want to accept that animals, creatures, people experience pain or experience love, and it's not because of one particular chemical process that goes on in the brain. If that were the case, then if you didn't have this chemical process, then you couldn't feel love, you couldn't feel pain. So take, for instance, something like a squid that has a completely different makeup as a human being. Squids would clearly lack the chemical or brain state feature that creates pain. So does that mean we should be able to do whatever we want with a squid? Just like I can go to a neighboring park and rip up some grass? Nobody's going to throw me in jail or yell at me for pulling out some grass. But if I go down to the ocean and find a squid farm or whatever, and then I just start spearing squid and just throwing them on shore and not doing it for eating, not doing it for any reason but to just spear these squid and throw them on the shore. This is something that we would kind of turn up our noses at. We would suggest that what I'm doing is wrong and that I'm harming something that's living that ought to be given similar treatment, even though we couldn't or can't explain how this thing emotes the way that we do or suffers the way that we do. So identity theory, while scientifically, while going forward scientifically, really has many problems in terms of creating an understanding, an umbrella understanding of how we deal with the phenomenal nature of mental processes. The next physicalist theory of the mind we're going to look at is functionalism. And functionalism really wonders what's so special about biology. Functionalism is going to try to overcome the problems of identity theory and really explain to us not what mental states are made from, but what mental states do. So for functionalists, we want to claim that the mind is the function of the body. And so we see this in many aspects of the world around us. Consider, for instance, something like a mousetrap. A mousetrap is a mousetrap based on how the thing functions. Notice how the function here can be multiply realized in different things. So for instance, on the far left picture, you see the very classic image of a mousetrap made out of wood and metal. Next to that, you see a metal cage, and then basically a toilet paper roll with a piece of food on the end, leaning off of a table, so that when the mouse runs through it to get the cheese, the whole thing just falls into a trash can. And then you have kind of a poisony casing of what looks like a can. A mouse, each one of these is a mousetrap. And it's not a mousetrap based on what it's made from, but instead it's a mousetrap based on what it does. So for instance, if something performed the action or performed the task of doing something, then it would be that thing. Take a chair, for instance. I can make a chair out of anything. I can make a chair out of cloth. I can make a chair out of wood, out of metal, out of a log. Right? There are so many ways I can realize the identity of a chair. But what makes it a chair is that it's there to be sat on. And so what makes something the mind for functionalists is not what it's made of, but that it functions like a mind. And for functionalists, what a mind functions as is something that will take in information of the world. There'll be some element of incoming sense data, some type of appraisal of the world around. It'll then organize that information, process that information in some way, and from there output a specific action or behavior that we would tend to associate with the input of information and the process of the information. So for instance, if we think of something like a thermostat is a thermostat just if it is able to receive input about the temperature of a room, process that information, even as a computer processes information, and then produce an output behavior such as turning on the air conditioning or turning off the heat. And so anything that can do this is a thermostat, regardless of what it is made of. So the functional role of a mental state depends upon its relation to those perceptual inputs of information, the process of organizing that information, and how it relates to other mental states within the system, and then some type of behavioral output. So something is a belief that it is raining if and only if it is caused by an experience of rain. It causes rain-relevant behaviors and then causes other rain-related mental states, such as not wanting to go outside or grabbing an umbrella before one leaves to go outside. So in terms of something like pain, for instance, going back to identity theory and C fibers, for functionalists, something is pain if it's caused by bodily damage or perhaps some sort of emotional damage, releases or relates to other mental states and beliefs or desires, such that you don't like this feeling, you are hurt by this, you create a sense of wincing or groaning or avoidance, you pull your hand away from what caused it pain, you hop up on one foot and grab your toe when you stub your toe. And each one of these parts just is the process, is the function of the mind. And this function is just physical brain activities that are going on, but they're going on in a way that creates a functional system. So instead of something being a mousetrap because it functions as a mousetrap, a thing is a mind when it functions like a mind. And how a mind functions is taking in information, processing information, and outputting some related behavior. This is similar to what we briefly looked at last time with behaviorism. But one of the main problems with behaviorism is the idea that just based on behavior, we're going to assign some sort of mental property. So if I'm crying, I must be sad. The only problem is that sometimes people cry for happy reasons or reasons that are not that they're sad. And so where functionalism overcomes behaviorism is the idea that you don't need to be sad when you cry. Just the fact that you're taking in information, processing that information as it relates to other things in the system, other beliefs, feelings, desires, etc., and then outputting some type of behavior that's associated with those internal feelings, desires, beliefs, whatever. That is the mind. It's that system functioning in that specific way. So the causal profile is definitive of the mental state in question. And no mental state has the same profile. And no profile could fail to be the mental state of that kind. So if I am attending a funeral and I'm trying to be strong for my loved ones, so I refrain from crying, that functional mental state, that mental state has a profile very subjective to my behavior. And it's not the case that I need to think of that behavior as only and strictly being me being strong for my loved ones, but still being sad and trying not to cry even though I am sad. So with functionalism, we can see the subjective nature that mental states are extremely individual to that functional role that's going on in the brain, that's going on in the system. And so as we learn new information, as we have new or more experiences, we add internal features so that when something happens, we now can use those internal features to help get us to act in some very specific way. And that way is always going to be individual for us. One plus to functionalism is that here we can overcome the problem of multiple realization. Different physical states or processes can embody the same cognitive process. And so we can account for multiple realization by adopting functionalism. And that way, we can assign mental properties to things that can be very different from us. Take, for instance, the chicken. The chicken, like a human, takes in information about the world. It senses predators, it senses the world around it, and taking in that information and processing that information is able to behave in a specific way by running around or feeling frightened or hiding. And so we can assume that the chicken has mental properties like humans because it's functioning in a very similar way. Now, even if it doesn't function in the same similar way, it's still functioning in a way based on the information taking in, process, and then output. And so it's doing exactly what a human does, but a human may do it in a more complex way. But just because a human processes the information in a more complex way doesn't necessarily mean that it alone has mental processes and the animal doesn't. I often watch the cartoon Futurama. If any of you have seen this cartoon, there's a character that's a big green blob that has a son that's a bully. And when you pour salt on these creatures, they dissolve into a puddle and then solidify in a couple hours. The idea of functionalism allows creatures like this, perhaps in the future, perhaps if we discover even more creatures at the bottom of the ocean, creatures like jellyfish or squid, things like this, to have a mind because they're doing exactly what a human mind does. It takes in information, it processes it, and then outputs some related behavior. So one of the benefits of functionalism is this idea that it can adapt for different things. So for instance, even just looking at something like a fish shows an array of intelligent behaviors. They can learn Pavlovian conditions, just like with the dog and ringing the bell and salivating. Light paired with food can attract fish and get fish to behave faster than animals like rats and dogs. We also see that that animals like fish can be hook shy, meaning that if they're caught fishing and then released back, they will not bite into hooks again because they know, they remember what has happened and have incredible spatial memories. They exhibit social learning. They recognize one another. They build nests, use tools, feel pain. And so because of all these things, fish are essentially showing us that they act, they exist in a similar way as humans do. There are a few problems with functionalism, however, and the first main one is what we refer to as the hard problem of consciousness. For functionalists, it's still difficult to explain why mental states feel the way they do. So we often use a term, qualia, and qualia means that what it's like to experience some mental episode. And so when I experience something in the world, there's something that it's like to experience that. And it's hard to explain how these physical parts of the body create this very phenomenal experience. So if you've ever worked out really hard, been in the sun all day, and then were given an ice cold glass of water, and had that incredibly refreshing, thirst-quenching feeling of drinking the water, there's an experience there. There is what it's like. There's something that's like that's difficult to be explained by physical phenomena. This is where your discussion question comes into play. Take, for instance, the example of colorblind Mary. Now, Mary is a woman who was born and raised in a black and white room, and she only knows the world through this black and white room with books that are black and white, a computer screen where the pages are black and white. And so all she ever knows is black and white. But she studies everything there is to know about color. So she looks up on the internet and in books how color works, how light reflects off of different objects, the lengths of different colored light wavelengths. And she becomes an expert in color. She knows everything there is to know about color. One day, Mary leaves the room and walks outside. And outside, she sees a garden and she sees a rose. And when she sees the rose, she has that epiphany of, oh my gosh, this is what a red rose looks like. Because all she had ever seen and all she had ever known from her reading was that how the color red works. But she never saw a picture with the color red. And so when she sees the color red for the first time, we want to say, or functionalists will want to say, that she has learned something new. And so if she learns something new, then it's hard for the functionalist to explain what that something new is. Excuse me, I misspoke. The functionalist is going to want to say that she didn't learn anything new, right? Because this qualia should not exist if I've gone about through all of the same physical properties that everybody else would go through. And so the functionalist is going to have to explain why Mary feels as if though she's learned something new, even though she knows everything already about color. Please make sure that you're looking at some of the videos for the colorblind Mary case, and also your reading is going to focus heavily on this specific scenario. Functionalists also run into the problem of the inverted spectrum. For functionalists, it's going to be the case that even if the causal profiles of our inner perceptual state is identical, the experience and output of our information should similarly be identical. So for instance, if I'm looking at these two colors, red on the left and green on the right, I'm taking in information from the world. My brain is telling me information about these two colors, and I am able to tell you that what's on the left is red and what's on the right is green. I can tell you that the color on the left is similar to the color of, let's say, a stop sign, while the color on the right is similar to a field of grass. Now, it could be the case that a person exists with an inverted spectrum. And what that means is that they too are taking in information from the pictures in front of you. The color on the right is red, the color on the left is red, the color on the right is green. They can associate the color on the left with stop signs, they can associate the color on the right with fields of grass. But the experience when seeing these colors are inverted. So the image on the left looks like the color on the right, and the color on the right looks like the color on the left. So if we flip these colors, but I can still associate each color with the similar object of stop sign and field of grass, so that my comparison matches to the person with the inverted spectrum's comparison, we're taking in the same information and processing it in the same way, it would be the case that we would have to see the same colors. But if someone's spectrum were inverted and they saw the opposite colors, then that experience would be something different. It would be something new. And so functionalism has this problem of if something creates the same process, if something has the same causal profile and the same inner perceptual states are identical, then it should be the case that the same qualitative experience exists. But if it doesn't, then functionalism will be wrong. Similar arguments attack the absence of qualia. So again, think back to something like the philosophical zombie. The philosophical zombie takes in information about the world and behaves accordingly, and then acts in that way. Because remember, when we talk about a philosophical zombie, the zombie behaves just like everybody else does. It takes in information, it exists just like everybody else, but there's no conscious experience. But with the functionalist, they're going to have to believe that if the zombie is functioning like a human, then it must be human and must have the same conscious properties, the same mental properties. So for a functionalist, a philosophical zombie could not exist. One argument against not necessary functionalism, but strong artificial intelligence, which relates to functionalism, is that of the Chinese room, proposed by Searle. I will put a 60-second video of this in the learning modules for this week. But essentially, what's happening here is that if I have someone locked in a room that does not speak Chinese, but inside the room is a book and a bunch of Chinese characters, and the book explains what characters to use when other characters are provided. And then let's say that someone who does speak Chinese is sliding notes under the door from outside of the room. The person in the room can take the note, match it up to symbols in the book. The book will tell it which symbols to send back under the door. Perhaps you can say or send this and this and this, but not this and this. You can send this and this, but not this. And so the person inside the room starts sliding symbols and notes under the door back to the person on the outside. This being the case, the person on the outside of the room may be tricked into believing that they're speaking with somebody who knows Chinese. However, I don't think we would be inclined to say that the person inside the room knows Chinese. They are simply just matching up Chinese characters and sliding them under the door. And so something like this would suggest that just because we take in information, process it, and output information, just because we function like a creature with mental properties, doesn't necessarily mean there are the mental properties that a person has. We can also look at something like the Chinese nation, for instance. The Chinese nation is a thought experiment where we gather together everybody who lives in China and give them little walkie-talkies where they can push a little button and it sends a signal to another Chinese person with a walkie-talkie. And because there are so many people living in China, it's supposed to represent all of the nerve cells in the brain. And hitting that button on the walkie-talkie and sending the signal would be similar to a brain cell moving across the synapse to another part of the brain and activating another part of the brain. In this instance, if we were to then take some robot, and these different walkie-talkie beeps would activate some different part of the robot, so that when a couple hundred people push their walkie-talkie button at a certain time, the robot would move its left leg. And then another couple hundred or a couple thousand people would push their button and it would move the right leg. and a couple 100,000 would push a button and it would inhale oxygen, and another couple hundred people would exhale, and so on and so forth, to mimic the physical actions of the brain. Because remember, the brain for a functionalist is physical, right? It is physicalism. So all that's in the brain is this physical stuff, these physical nerves and cells just kind of firing, and we do and experience the things we experience. So this is mimicking a human. Now, a functionalist would have to suggest that this robot is just as conscious as a human being. And it, like us, have memories and ambition and mood, feel pain and everything else. But most people would be inclined to say that the Chinese nation, the robot associated with the Chinese nation, does not have consciousness. It's just moving around based on these signals being sent. And if that's the case, how is that we differentiate it from a human brain? If a brain is just sending signals to different parts of the brain, then we're no different than the robot and the people with walkie-talkies. And so functionalism still has a very large hurdle to overcome in its explanation of what it's like to experience mental phenomena, and really this idea of consciousness. And so, as we conclude our look at functionalism, we have to go back and ask, what is the mind in terms of this system, and is it even a physical system? Or should we go back to substance dualism and say, well, no, there's something more to a mind than just these physical properties of the brain shooting around information. We often associate the mind with a computer. A computer does very similar things a mind does. But does your computer in front of you feel pain? Does it have a mood? Does it have ambition? These things are problems with functionalism. We're going to want to say, or we're inclined to say, back to Descartes, right? No, we're special, we're different. There's something more than just this physicality of the brain. But if there is, then we go back to square one and really have to understand, well, what is this thing that's different? And so in each instance of physicalism and dualism, we see that there is this problem of understanding what consciousness is, how it works, and if they're separate, how one connects with the other. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, please let me know, email me, or bring them up in the discussions. I would ask to look up the term philosophical zombies, the thought experiment. If you just type in Chinese nation thought experiment or Chinese room thought experiment into your Google search bar, you'll get a full explanation of these thought experiments and how they relate to functionalism. And like always, enjoy the rest of your week, and I will post some more announcements and lectures in the coming days. Oh, have a good week.